Hi, and welcome to World History. So today we are going to be looking at motivations for exploration. How does it all begin? Why do people want to, in Europe, want to all of a sudden leave the safety of their home and venture out across oceans, facing possible death? Right, so we're looking at the motivation today, as well as the technology needed. And so you've probably heard the phrase necessity is the mother of invention, and it never applies more than to this time period in history. So looking at causes, right? What's going to take you to change drastically and to bring about changes that are going to be so long lasting? What has to occur? Or something has to push people into this. And so what we see is that Europeans had been trading with Asia for a long time. But what we mean by that, Europeans had been buying Asian goods. And how they got those Asian goods was through the Silk Road. The goods from Asia, China, Japan, India, came across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, into Turkey, and eventually into Italy. And so Europeans weren't going someplace to do the trading. The goods from Asia were being brought to Europe. Right? And so this is a type of ship that people would have had in the 1300s prior to exploration. Very heavy ship, but you see it has a square sail, it has one mast, it has a fixed rudder. It's not good for sailing in the ocean where you're going to have storms. You're going to have to be able to ride the waves. You need to be able to maneuver when the winds and the current aren't to your advantage. And so this ship is great for trading from England to France and France to Holland and France to Spain and across to maybe Greek or northern Africa. It's not good for going around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. So this is what happens. The ancient Silk Road, which is not technically a road, it was trading routes. And you see that the red line starts in China over on the right, and it moves towards Italy. And so notice the camels, right? They're all heading to Italy. And that's where everything goes. From Italy, it's then going to be dispersed throughout Europe. And this is also what leads to the Renaissance in Italy. The Italian merchants are getting incredibly wealthy because they are the first person and they're going to have a huge markup on the goods as it's sold then to other merchants who then take it to different locations around Europe. What happens though is there's the fall of the Mongolian Empire, right? So you see Mongolia over on the right, you see the wall of China. So the Mongols basically fall apart. The dynasty falls apart. And the Silk Road, the trade routes become very unsafe. And so there's a lot of pirating, there's a lot of destruction, high taxes have to be paid in certain places, and it just becomes dangerous and costly to get goods on the Silk Road. You can't depend on something being transported that way. And that Silk Road had been in existence for about, for 1400 years. So you wonder, well, why didn't they go to Asia before? It was working. Nobody really thought of it. These were all luxury goods, right? It's not just tea, but it's also the cup that the tea comes in, that porcelainware, silk, spices, which are very, very expensive at this time. We're talking about $20 a pound for sugar. We're talking about $25 a pound for pepper. Cinnamon might be $30 a pound, so extremely expensive when you figure that somebody's wages might be $8 a day. Um, and so it was profitable for the wealthy people, but as this falls apart, it's just not working. And so this is what motivates people. They say, I still want my goods. I still want my spices. I still want my luxury silks. I still want tea and fancy dinnerware. Right? So number one is economic gain. Right? I'm going to go there because if I can get to Asia, I can control the trade. I'm going to become wealthy. The heck with the Italian people in Florence. My nation will be wealthy. I will be wealthy. And people will have to pay me a premium cost for these trade goods. So we would put that under G for greed, right? that welcome me quickly. And so G, greed, or gold. We're going to talk about the three G motivators. All right, more trade, more wealth, more gold in that treasury box. All right, faith comes into it. And so at this time in the 1400s, we have Spain, which is a Catholic nation. We have France, was a Catholic nation. And England's going to be changing. In the 1400s, they're still a Catholic nation. But Portugal, Spain, and France, definitely Catholic nations. And so they see that part of their duty, if you're a king or queen at this time, you are ruling by what's known as divine right. Divine right means that God has put you on that throne. And therefore, you are basically a vessel that God works through. And you represent God and you owe God. And so many monarchs, especially in Spain and in Portugal, felt it was their duty to pay back and to spread their faith. And so we see the second G, God. Okay. Now, we're not going to talk about England because by the time England really starts exploring, we're looking at Queen Elizabeth I. She is a Protestant monarch. She's a Christian who is not, she's of the Church of England, and she really doesn't feel the need to spread her faith. Um, in fact, if anything, it becomes a reason, right, for later people going into the colonies is because they feel it's a very personal faith and it's very individual how you worship. And so they don't feel the need to share that with others. So we have greed and God. And with God, we're going to see it's mainly from the Catholic nations, especially Spain and Portugal. Right. And then the third G that we're going to look at is glory. I want to become famous. I want my nation to become powerful. If you've ever heard the phrase for king and country, right? That is why I'm going to go out. I'm going to become famous. Kids will read about me for 400 years later. My king will like me. I'll be given a knighthood. As a king, my country will be more powerful. People will know who we are, and we can stick our flag and grounds all over the place. So, glory for different reasons and different people. Right. So these are known as the three G's, or the motivations for exploration in the late 1400s, and all of that comes about because of the fall of the Silk Road. All right, next we're going to look at problems and solutions. So you have a desire to get to Asia, you want to become wealthy, you want to spread your faith, you want to become famous, right? And so the problem, of course, is that the Silk Road is just not safe. But the other problem is you can't get there yet. How are you going to get to Asia? And so you need navigation and you need ships. And navigation, the very word navi coming from navy, right? Sailing vessel, and gate is to go. So to navigate is how your ships will go. But you then need more advanced ships that can actually withstand the rigors of ocean sailing and be big enough to bring back all those trade goods you're going to be buying. All right. So the problem is no one's gone to Asia. You want to get there. You want to get those three G's in your back pocket. So what do we see? Technology, these ships have to change. Right? You have to move away from that square sail, single mast, and stable rudder that we looked at earlier. Right? So we go to the triangular sails, the rudders, many masts. This is going to enable you to have more horsepower. You're going to be able to sail a big heavy ship faster. You're going to be able to pick up more winds. You're going to be able to do that tacking in and against the currents. You're going to be able to get where you need to go. All right. So thank you, Portuguese, for creating the first ships that were ocean worthy, the caravels and the carracks. So the carrack is what we think of when we think of a pirate ship. They're going to be the big, heavy, wide ships, many, many sails on them. They're going to carry cannons to protect yourself, but they're also going to be able to carry big loads that you're buying, right? All the tons of peppercorns that you're buying, all the silks and the tea, all of that has to be transported. You need a big, heavy ship to make it worth your journey, right? You also need food for your sailors and other equipment that you have to hold on board. And these ships are not like cruise ships. They don't have separate cabins for everybody. The only person who really gets a cabin is the captain, and perhaps if you had some Catholic priests on board, they might get a cabin to themselves. And then the caravel. Caravel is going to be a little bit smaller, still going to have many masts and triangular sails. Those are going to be smaller ships that can maneuver better, get a little bit closer into port. And by the way, when you see a ship like this and it has that big red cross on that, that is not a nation that you're looking at, but that is the symbol of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And again, this would have been Portuguese ships, and who were they sailing for? They're sailing for their faith. All right, so we have the ships. Portuguese, thank you, have invented ships that are ocean worthy, right? And now we have to look at navigation. How do you know where you are on Earth? So latitude, right? We're looking at like a ladder, the rungs of a ladder going north and south, right? And so you're going to measure using a star above the horizon. Those two stars that you're going to use is the sun in the daytime and probably the North Star at night, but you could use other stars if you know where their location is a certain date. You have to have timing, so you have an hourglass, because at that point, it's the only type of timer that works. Regular clocks have a lot of gears, and what happens when those gears get rocked and rolled on a ship, they lock up and your clock stops working. And it would usually be a young boy's job to stand on deck, and this is going to be, you're going to have to take shifts and do this at night. You're going to have to do this also during storms, and you would flip that hourglass and you would write down when you flipped it. Of course, what's the problem? If you're not moving at a steady speed, it doesn't really help you to know how long you've been traveling, right? Uh, and so that becomes a problem, because to know longitude, so latitude tells you where you are north or south. Longitude is telling you where you are east or west. So it's big, long north to south lines that tell you are east or west. And when you combine those two, then you know where you are. Well, the only way to know your longitude is to know what time it was where you left and what time it is where you are now. Well, if you don't have a clock that works, you really can't do that. So longitude is going to take a while for people to figure out. It's really into the 1700s. They can do that very well before a clock is invented that can withstand that. So using the stars, and there's a few National Geographic pages that you can look up, and you have people who, in the Philippines, some of the sailors there, some of the indigenous people would create these stick maps with islands and currents on them. Uh, but for European sailors, they're going to use the stars, but they're going to use tools with those stars. All right, so the main tool that they're going to use is called an astrolabe. Astro meaning star, labe meaning to measure. And so the astrolabe can measure the star's distance. You just need to know the date. And so you would get a set of charts that come with the astrolabe. And if you look these up, there's examples. There's Galileo. I think maybe the U.S. Smithsonian Museum has Galileo's astrolabe. Different museums have different famous people's astrolabes. It would be a very common instrument that educated people, wealthy people, especially 14, 1500s, 1600s, even into the 1700s, would be familiar with. All right, and that comes from the Arabs. So when I would teach in a classroom and I would say astrolabe comes from the Arabs, right? And it's measuring the stars, astro. All right, compass. And we may think of a compass. That's usually people's first thing. Well, why don't they use a compass? Well, they did. But the problem is the compass tells you where you're going. It doesn't tell you where you are. If you're sailing a ship, you need to also know where you are. But the compass was important, as we see in this sketch. These are big compasses. These are not handheld compasses. It's going to tell you the direction your ship is heading in. So the quartermaster might read, or the person who's looking at the map, the captain might say, okay, we need to head in a northerly direction or a northeast direction. And they would say, well, okay, let's head our ship in that direction. And then you could adjust accordingly. All right. And this is a world map. And we see here that it's 1459. This was made for the King of Portugal. It is over 6 foot wide. It was a wall map, right? So this is one that they're going to put up on the wall. This would show what they knew of the world. And so if we start at the 12 o'clock position, right, we have Russia. If we go to the 3 o'clock position, that's going to be Asia. It's going to be China and Japan. We look at 6 o'clock, we're looking at the south of Africa. And if we go to 9 o'clock, we're looking at Europe and Northern Africa. And so that's what this map shows here. Right. And of course, we would not have any of this without the printing press. Without the printing press, none of this would have been possible because you have to be able to replicate your map. So as people went forward and they start to sail places, they map where they've been. They come back and they sent it to a printmaker. They now can sell copies of that map, and the next person goes out and they advance their map ideas. And that's really how the sailing and exploration really exploded, is with the sharing of ideas. They weren't just guessing. Uh, they were going out bit by bit and step by step. All right, and then we get into cartography, which is that map making again. And this is a French map in 1566. You can see it's drawn in our perspective upside down, right, with this would be southern part of the Earth on top. And so you can see at least here the Americas by 1566 have been added. Australia has also been added, right? North America is looking a little shady. We don't even have all of Australia in there yet, right? And this is if you flip it, you see how it looks. Africa is looking a lot better. Well, the Indian Ocean still looks quite a mess. Indian Ocean into Australia, that Oceania area, it's not looking very clear, right? So we have the technology problem solved, right? So what are the dangers? How do you overcome the dangers that you're going to come into, right? Well, first you have to figure out, well, what dangers are you going to have? Where are you going, right? Where are they going to explore? So now we're looking at the race for trade routes. So we're going to keep that other paper handy. We're going to go back to that, but we're also going to look at who's going where. And I have these in the order. There's no surprise. The Portuguese being the ones who created the first ships. They're also the first to sail. They sail to Africa. And you can look at this map and just see the location, how close they are to Africa. And so, they go from Lisbon to north of Africa. They go back safely. Then they go to some of the islands and they go back safely. And all the while, they're mapping and charting and writing down what it takes to get there. And here, I like this painting because just look at the sails on these ships, right? The sails almost overpower the ships in this painting to me. And you can just see, I don't know, it's just something that's what I notice is the sails. And you can almost think about the power that's going to be with these ships coming in, and notice the different masts and the triangular sails on there and how high up in the back the ships are going. They're quite big and quite broad. So the reason that Portugal really takes the lead in exploration is because of this guy, Prince Henry the Navigator, right? Shout out to him. So when you think of Portugal, P for Prince Henry, right? And what did he do? He never navigated any place. That was an honorary term. What Prince Henry does is he has money, and he has a great idea to make Portugal the superpower of Europe. And how's he going to do that? He brings in all the best map makers, all the best ship makers, the best sailors, the best captains, and he brings all these great minds together. And it's almost like an academy of maritime sailing. And that's what they do. They research and they figure out. And so he really helps to fund exploration. Honestly, without him, I don't know when or who would have been the leader, because he really pushes Portugal. So again, here we see Portugal, and you can see it's covered, three sides by water. They're right there on the edge. They're also very close to Africa, excuse me. So You can see here how close they are to Africa and why that's a logical place, and they would seek to go around Africa first. So, again, why didn't anybody go there? What dangers are we talking? The Sea of Darkness, the Kraken, right? Nobody in Europe had ever sailed below the Horn of Africa. And there were great stories of death, destruction. The sea would have this big whirlpool that would suck you down into it, almost like a dark hole in space. And a lot of the same ideas that we have with space and being scared to travel into space is very similar to what people of that time thought. They knew the world was round. Nobody doubted that it was round at that time, but they didn't know what was out there. So even though they knew that the earth was round, they didn't know what the ocean held there. And so if we look at this map, we can see that the blue lines, we see how Portugal gradually goes step by step. First A to B, B to A, then A to B and C. And then they go back, C, B, A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A. And eventually they go around. And now they're taking care of that danger problem, at least some of the danger. They're building trading posts where they can stop, they can rest, they can work on their ships if it was damaged in a storm. They can gather fresh water if they need any. If their crew gets sick, they can rest for a while. And so this becomes very, very beneficial. And it's almost like, think of rest stops if you go on a road trip. You need to pull off, you need to get gas for your car, you need to get water, you need to use the bathroom, right? Those kind of things that we want to do as we travel, well, they were also necessary for the Portuguese. All right, so oceans that are seaworthy communicate best sea routes, trading posts, and again, those are going to be sort of like your rest stops. What about the expense? Yeah, the average person had nowhere near the money to invest because you not only have to build your ship, you have to pay for your crew, you have to feed your crew, you have to pay for a captain, right? The quartermaster. There's so much that goes into. You have to have sails. You have to have extra sails. It's sort of like you have to have extra tires in case your car breaks down, right? How do you pay for all that? In addition, you have to have a lot of money to buy those goods that you want, those trade goods. How are you going to pay for those tons of peppercorns you're going to buy? How are you going to pay for those tons of tea that you're going to buy in Asia? So you have to have cash. Really, they only took silver or gold. China especially preferred silver. So you had to have that money with you. It's not like, hey, here's my card. It didn't work that way. You had to have cash on hand. So what we see here are joint stock companies. And a joint stock company, we're going to refer to them a few times as we move forward. These are really your first businesses. The difference is that a joint stock company had to have the permission of the monarch. And we see these especially in England and Holland. And so what happens is 10, 20, 50 wealthy men get together and they each put in money, and maybe then they buy 50 ships. Well, if 4 of those ships fail or go down in a storm, that's terrible, but they've got 46 that might make it back and make them a profit. It's much better than one person owning one ship and that one ship goes down and you lose everything. So joint stock companies were a way to share in profits and the risk and loss. All right, so Jamestown, Virginia is a colony that was started by a joint stock trading company. We have the Dutch West India Company. You have the Virginia Company. Another very famous one is the East India Trading Company. This trademark label is from the year 1600. CEIC, East India Trading Company. Not owned by the monarch. These are going to be individual owners, but they have to have permission of the king. And of course, the government's going to get taxes. You know. All right, so the Dutch, English, and French had joint stock companies. The two biggest are going to be the Dutch. In fact, they had a Dutch East India, and eventually it's going to have a Dutch West India. And then there was East India Trading Company, the Hudson River Trading Company, Hudson Bay Trading Company. Right. So the joint stock companies are going to help them with that expense of the voyage. So this is how they solve the problem, right? You have the technology, you make it safer by charting it and by sharing and communicating the best and safest routes. You learn the currents of the and such, and then the voyages, how you cut down on the risk and the expense, and then everybody gets to share in the wealth. Oh, too far. All right. Now, everybody was also everybody was also Portuguese were mainly heading to Asia around Africa. But the English and French and Dutch didn't really want to compete too much with the Portuguese at first. So they start looking for a northwest passage. Once after the Spanish arrived in the Americas and they realized that mm, there's some really big land here, but they're convinced that there's got to be a shortcut through the land. So you have Henry Hudson going into what's now New York City and what's now the Hudson River, thinking he's going to take a northwest passage. You have the French going into St. Lawrence River, hoping for a northwest passage. And Columbus and the other Spanish men that came continually searched for a passage south, a southwest passage. All right, so here we are with that race for trade routes. We have Portugal. They are the first to sail around Africa. And again, it's location, 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 right? In 1488, it's the first time in a European sails around Africa that we know of. You have to come back and write the storybook. If you don't do it and write a story, we don't know what happened in history. All right, and then we have Spain in 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue, ends up in the Caribbean, although he thinks he's in Oceania. He thinks he's in the Indies, and so that's why I end up with people being called Indians. That's why we have the Caribbean is known as the West Indies, because you have the Eastern Indies, which are the original islands off of India. Right? And Columbus is actually going to sail 5 more times to the Americas. This is not a once done deal. And of course, the Spanish king is going to continue to send many people. And Spain, with Spain, we see the king paying the cost of these, and Portugal also. All right, English, King Henry sends off John Cabot in 1497. He claims Newfoundland. Right. But we don't see too much from the English. They're a little bit busy for a while. All right. And then we're going to get to the French. That's 1524. They explore North America from North Carolina to Maine. If you've ever been around New York City, there's the Verrazano Bridge. There's the Verrazano Narrows, which is waterway up along by West Point. 1534, you have Jacques Cartier, who comes in at the St. Lawrence River, and then you have Nez Perce rock that he comes aboard at. And he's the one, so Cartier is really the one who sort of lands in what we would think of New France and Canada. We'll talk about that in a later class. And last but not least, we have the Dutch in 1609. Sending Henry Hudson in what is now the Hudson River, again outside of New York City. Again, they're looking for those waterways for that Northwest Passage to get to Asia. And the Dutch are going to settle New Netherlands. They're going to settle some land there. Now, one of the reasons the Dutch, it takes so long for them to get going, is the Dutch were actually a colony of Spain. And that's also why England is slow to get involved after 1497. We don't really see much from the English until into the mid 1500s, and most of their first tries are failures because England was at war with Spain, and part of it was trying to free the Dutch from Spanish control. So, again, another story, another adventure there. And just to show you, I'm going to include these on your primary source sheets. But this is a map of Africa from 1554. And I like the map. It shows you some kingdoms and it shows you some animals and people. But compare that to the map in that's, 30 years later, 1584, and you can again see the power of the printing press and communication and just repeated voyages and how that map has changed. And then we look again at this map in 1664 that's changed again. And look at the detail on this map. We have the animals, we look at all the ships in the ocean. You have native dress of different people, you have trading posts across the top, and I will include a link to this. It's on your handout sheet, but I'll try to also include one for this video page. All right, so the main thing is what motivated them, the Europeans, is God. Catholic monarchs want to spread their faith. Glory, European nations are in competition for power. And greed, gold, desire for wealth from trade. Right, and so this we can look at the individual level, and then we can also look at the monarch and national level. So that does it for video 1.